All right, hello, welcome to our session on health inequities at this wonderful ISR symposium. I'm Helen Meier. I'm an assistant research professor in the Survey Research Center here, and I'm going to be your facilitator for this afternoon. The goal of this session is to highlight ISR's contributions to health inequities research, as well as the individual contributions of our two esteemed speakers, wonderful people, Dr. Sarah Burgard and Dr. Arline Geronimus. We'll also discuss the future of health inequities research broadly and talk about some of how our work here at ISR responds to social issues of the day. Just some housekeeping for the flow of the session. First, we'll hear from Dr. Burgard and then from Dr. Geronimus, followed by a robust question and answer session. So I do ask you to hold your questions until the end. We'll have our speakers join us up front and we'll hopefully have a lovely discussion. If you write your questions down, or we all have hand computers now with notes apps, so you can you won't forget, you can write them down. So with that, let's just get going. Our first speaker is Dr. Sarah Burgard. She's the director of the Population Study Center here at ISR, as well as has many faculty appointments across the university, including sociology, the Ford School of Public Policy, and the School of Public Health. Dr. Burgard conducts research on the social stratification of aging and health with population-based survey data, and has extensive work on the social factors underlying health disparities by socioeconomic status, gender, race, ethnicity, and across the life course. And today she's going to give us her tour of health inequities research at ISR. So please welcome Dr. Sarah Burgard.
Thanks so much, Helen. Thank you to the organizers. I mean, what an incredible event. Thank you to PSC. Personally, I need to thank PSC. David Lamb welcomed me to PSC as a research assistant professor in 2005, and I've found myself unable to leave since. And now I am fortunate to be the director of the PSC, which is really incredible opportunity. I'm going to talk brag a little bit about PSC's training program a little bit later in my presentation. I also wanted to note that when I was an assistant professor those many years ago, I was asked to co-organize the PSC 50th reunion with Al Hermelin back in the day. And it was one of the most intimidating and special things I've done at my time at the University of Michigan. But being invited to speak today about health inequities research at ISR was just as intimidating. And so I hope I do a reasonable job. I really want to point out again that the incomplete in the title, this is just a very, very broad discussion of some of the ways Michigan has contributed. And there's no way to cram in all the examples or people I could include. So I'm really sorry to tell you that right off the bat. So just first, I wanted to tell you the definition of how I think about health inequities, just in case you were wondering maybe the difference between terms like inequity or inequality or difference. And in the literature, I think one of our departments in the School of Public Health is named Health Behavior and Health Equity now. And Arline will be speaking from that department in a moment. Inequalities are differences, but inequities are differences in health status or in the distribution of resources that are needed for health between different population groups that arise from the social conditions in which people are born, they grow up, they live, they work, they age. And it's a term that is used explicitly to define unfair differences, not just differences, where there's an issue of social injustice. And that's something that has defined a lot of the work at ISR in this area. And to address, I would say, health inequities via social science research, you can't simply just rely on population-based sampling of the general population and say, I've done my job. Everybody is getting equal treatment, like the people on the left. Everybody's getting this survey of households. You have to think more strategically and in a more innovative way about study design, about participant recruitment, about sharing and linking of data, about training new scientists that might be different across the groups you want to study. The old way of doing things may not always apply, and that's something ISR has been outstanding at, finding ways around. So I'm going to talk about, in a few minutes, 75 years of advances, ISR's incredible skill at the full research life cycle, the underlying work and actions that it has taken to lead ISR to support excellence in health inequities research here and around the world. And I'm going to talk about 4 domains where we have led this research, many of which are deeply service-oriented, right? This is not about selfish scholarship, about narcissistic attention to somebody's own CV. This is about building the tools and the resources necessary to make the science better at all levels. And so I'll talk about how some of our colleagues, past and present, have invested in deep work in the theory and measurement of health inequities and their causes. I'm going to include a shout out to some of the field leading study design and data collection work that have kept so many of us in this building busy, and doing that on behalf of the whole research world. And there'll be, of course, mention of decades of investment in training the next generation of health inequities researchers. And of course, how could I fail to celebrate the innovations driven by ISR in data linkage and data dissemination so that this incredible work can be spread across the social science and health science community. So I'm going to start with a core example that illustrates these components really well. The study of racial health inequities at ISR across the years. About 25 years into ISR's history, the Program for Research on Black Americans folks at the Research Center for Group Dynamics launched some field-changing work in measurement and data collection based on their focused attention to the conditions of living for Black Americans. And while past research on stress and resiliency in the field of psychology and elsewhere was driven by theories and exposures important to majority populations, PRBA scholars were focused on the experiences of African Americans in particular and recognized the limitations of measurements of stress and coping that were available. So they recognized the need for new measures of discrimination and racism. And the 1995 Detroit area study was pivotal in developing these new measurement tools. Was anybody here involved in a Detroit area study? A couple of hand raises. It used to be this very crucial training piece of the sociology department for graduate students who went out and did interviews and helped design the study and use these data for dissertations. And the 95 Detroit area study was really important because it helped the PIs who you can't read here, which are James Jackson and David Williams, who you just heard from in the atrium, to steer toward new measures of discrimination. And these led to capturing how discrimination and racism were experienced by the residents in Detroit, leading to some new items that are now on many major national surveys of the population. And these include the major experiences of discrimination scale and everyday discrimination. And has anybody ever used one of these measures in their own research? I'm sure many of you have know about these, have used them. And so in the major discrimination question, respondents were asked, "We are interested in your perceptions about the way other people have treated you. Can you tell me if any of the following has ever happened to you?" So experiences kind of inimical to a survey question, right? Have you ever been unfairly fired from a job or denied a promotion? Not hired for a job, unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened or abused by the police? Unfairly discouraged by a teacher or advisor from continuing your education, prevented from moving into a neighborhood, or denied a bank loan. Particular experiences of minoritized individuals in the US in that period and in earlier periods, which could lead to health inequities down the road. And even in 2021, this is a screenshot from a 60 Minutes episode that was aired during the COVID epidemic. And it featured the everyday discrimination scale, which is up on the slide as well. And David Williams was interviewed for this feature on how racism harms Black Americans' health. And so you can see the everyday discrimination scale, which is a classic. Many of us have used it in our research, that asks about, in your day-to-day life, how often do any of the following things happen to you? You are treated with less courtesy than other people, less respect than other people. You receive poorer service. People act as if they think you're not smart. They are afraid of you. They think you are dishonest. They act as if they're better than you are. You are called names or insulted, or you are threatened or harassed. All experiences in everyday life in many institutional settings that minoritized individuals could face. And this everyday discrimination scale has been used as is. It's been adapted by many researchers across the country and the world. So it was very clear that the design of new measures of stressful exposures was important to the PRBA key investigators. But once you have a measure, now you need a data set, right? You need a large enough sample of people with enough variation in the sample to test out these appropriate measures. And so in 1977, the National Panel Survey of Black Americans was first launched. It was the first national data on how symptoms of distress are defined and responded to by Black Americans. And it was followed up in 2001 with the National Survey of American Life, the largest ever investigation of the mental health of African Americans and people from the Caribbean of African descent. So there were new challenges here, right? The ISR people were so well poised to address. They had to develop ways of sampling for appropriate coverage, sample size, comparison groups in populations that might be resistant to being interviewed for lots of good reasons because of how they've been treated in society. And ISR had the right people to do this work, and they had the ability to make these data available for the public and to launch a generation of careers through the program for research on Black Americans. So cheers to RCGD. But this is a number of years ago. Obviously, this research continues today. We don't have to rest on our laurels, though, in thinking about racial health inequities research in ISR. So PRB and the surveys and the measures they launched are a really key part of ISR's heritage, but things have really kaleidoscoped out since then. There is a need for new and representative data covering a range of ethno-racial groups as the demography of this country and other countries continues to evolve. And there's a demand for cost-effective data collection, especially on smaller or harder to reach groups. And so the paper and the NIH grant that supported it that I'm highlighting here were led by our colleague, Dr. Sung-Hee Lee, and supported by our colleagues in the program in survey and data sciences. And to obtain a large enough sample of Korean American respondents for this work on health, Dr. Lee and colleagues had to innovate with web-based respondent-driven sampling and leverage the power of peer referrals, new methods that we can approach to reach groups that might be hard to find in a regular population-based sample. And they learned about the promises and the pitfalls of using this kind of design, and then helped others in the research community to know about those. So the thing about ISR that's really special is the integration of the survey research operations with the Survey Research Center faculty and the program in survey and data science. This is the place where survey design and data collection for health inequities research has been pioneered, especially for groups that have been under-researched in past work. I can't do justice to all the people doing amazing work with particular disparities and inequities populations today, but I know you know of many. And to achieve all those great things in theory, in measurement, in study design, data collection, we need the best new scientists. And I'm gonna make the difficult claim here that ISR does a pretty good job of creating them. ISR and the U of M have been leaders in several social science fields for many years in developing scholars from previously underrepresented and minoritized groups in the US Academy and globally. Some of the core programs that are hosted at ISR are listed here. So we can see the Program for Research on Black Americans, which has had an enormous impact in psychology, social work, public health, and across a range of social science fields in developing scholars who study Black Americans. The Meier program that's hosted also in our CGD in Southeast Michigan. Racism Lab in SRC that's led by our colleague, Dr. Maggie Hicken, and the PSE graduate and postdoctoral training program, which has been developing scholars in a number of health inequities populations and from a wide array of groups. ISR's history in driving the study of racial health inequities has laid the groundwork for contemporary innovations in health inequities research. For example, very importantly, the move beyond survey questions alone to biomeasurement of health and function. So why is it so important for health inequities research that we do this, despite the fact that it's just really fantastically cool? A few of the reasons we might think about are that biomeasures can capture change inside your body more quickly than you can recognize it, right? And why is this important? Because a lot of the old survey measures of health differences across groups relied on questions like, has a doctor ever told you that you have arthritis, right? And that requires that somebody has access to a doctor to give them that diagnosis. And we know that different groups have differential access to that kind of healthcare and diagnostic types of outcomes. It's also important because it captures differences across groups who may have different levels of stigma in reporting about a certain health condition, for example, right? So for inequities research, we need to think about all the reasons why self-reported health measures might include some problems for us and why biomeasures as a supplement to that could be really important. So the NIA Biomarker Network, which I highlight here, is funded by NIH and housed at ISR. It's been dedicated to improving the measurement of biological risk for later life health outcomes, and not surprisingly at all, if you know ISR, by doing this in large representative samples of populations in the wild, right? This is not about doing it in a lab. This is about taking it out into the real world and getting adequate samples of people from lots of different places in the social life. So the network works on questions like those noted on the slide. What array of biological markers can be included reliably and validly in a big population study, and has broken new ground on what we can measure under the skin, again, outside in the field. Another really incredible resource at ISR for health inequities research that I wanted to give a shout out to is the Biosocial Methods Collaborative and its home lab, which is downstairs in the basement. And if you've never had a tour of it before, it's definitely worth a look. But the idea here is, again, bringing theoretical and lab-based measures to the social sciences in real-world context, not in a lab where people are going to be behaving in ways that are not natural. They wouldn't behave that way in their normal social life. So I've listed two of the projects that have been conducted in the home lab downstairs. And they just talk about some of the kinds of things we can measure while the person is going about their activities that we're trying to observe: sweat response, respiration, heart rate, accelerometry, all kinds of other indicators that can be kind of painlessly measured while somebody is figuring out, like, what does it take to put stuff on the top shelf? How can we measure activities of daily life and limitations in those in a way that they would be happening as you're walking around your own kitchen, right? So again, a more naturalistic setting. This second, stress and well-being in everyday life, allows us to get out of a carefully, classically controlled white coat laboratory environment where you're sitting there given a laboratory stress test versus what would happen in your living room, right? So more naturalistic and more powerful measurement for different groups. I also wanted to point out the incredible number of groundbreaking grants at ISR that have been used to move data collection into the biomeasures landscape. So in this grant that I listed here that was led by some of our SRC colleagues in the PNG group, a few of whom are in the room today, longitudinal epigenome-wide data were assembled for 2,000 children so that they could examine methylation patterns and look at epigenetic associations with the exposures that we know are important for health inequities: social adversity, socio-emotional development, biological processes. And these two papers show how such data can be used to understand the way unequal social environments could modify the genome and lead to health inequalities, right? So looking at structural racism in primary schools and changes in epigenetic age acceleration among Black and white youth, or the longitudinal associations between paternal incarceration and family well-being, and how that could lead across the life course to health disparities. I also would encourage you to look at the Landscapes of Structural Racism in Health program that just emerged in SRC from many of our colleagues, but is focusing in on some of these ways that the molecular mechanisms and the social environment interact to create complex health disparities and unequal trajectories of healthy aging. And in terms of bringing it to the next generation, we have some really industrious colleagues who do amazing workshops for bringing genomics to the social sciences. So you can go to workshops. They will allow you to just go to their website and figure out how you too can do hair collection protocols in your population-based study. This is the kind of just hard-won knowledge that our colleagues are putting out into the public sphere so we can do a better job of figuring out whether some of these new measures might help us in our inequities research of the future. I wanted to give a shout out to PSC on the training the next generation and turning theory into measures and analyses. I have a list of papers here. On the top left corner, there's a paper from demography from a number of years back that was written by two of our PSC trainees together on non-heterosexuality, relationships, and young women's contraceptive behavior. So one of the areas of health inequity that has been a new area of focus has been on sexual and gender minorities, and also the intersectional connections between sexual and gender minority status and ethno-racial identities. So people have really been taking on the challenge of intersectional research. In the middle and in the top right of the slide, you'll see two papers that include a current PSC postdoc and one of our colleagues in the Health Behavior and Health Education Department, Christy Gamerel, who is part of our training faculty, who are looking at racial ethnic differences in the association between transgender-related US state policies and self-rated health of transgender women, or Black-white differences in mortality risk among transgender and cisgender people in recent years. And so they're really breaking ground and finding ways in a difficult data landscape to try to understand these levels of inequality and equity for multiply marginalized people. And so in order to do this, Brady, who's right in the row over there, and some of his colleagues have been working on figuring out how different options within a survey or pieces of questions we already typically include could be used to get estimates for the associations between sexual identity, reproductive health, and substance use, and how we might move on from old ways of measurement to new ways of measuring these particular minoritized inequity groups. So finally, I wanted to turn to kind of the final link in the gold chain of ISR's amazingness. And so we're going to get to data linkage and data dissemination, just really a quick look at some of the incredible things that people are doing. Once we've developed measures, we've put them into really outstanding survey and study designs. We've collected innovative new data. What do we do with it? We could sit on it, but we don't. We link it to other data and we give it away to everybody. So NANDA is a national neighborhood data archive run by some of our colleagues in SRC who are also friends of PSC. It's a publicly available data archive of measures of physical, economic, demographic, and social environments at multiple levels of spatial scale. So if you have census tract indicators, zip code indicators, county indicators, you can link in these environmental data, neighborhood level and beyond, to your existing study to really try to understand how the landscape of inequity creating exposures might be operating in your population. So there's just a few examples of some of the kinds of measures that are included here, from polluting sites to the primary and secondary roadways that could create pollution or allow for transport to institutional spaces, public transit, social services, school district characteristics, et cetera. And so they're also doing these fantastic trainings. There was a really neat workshop this summer that was hosted by NANDA that our ISR director gave the keynote at to really try to promote the use and exciting aspects of these NANDA data. And I'm sure my colleagues would be delighted to help you use it. And then finally, any talk about ISR and data dissemination or linkage would be really remiss if we didn't mention ICPSR and all that they've done to really bring to the world inequities related data for health researchers. So one of the things that they've done is to train in the summer program a diverse community of scholars in statistical techniques and research methods. They have data collections that they release for certain particular inequities populations. They have what's called the demographic, oh, I forgot what the acronym. This means I have to turn in my U of M ID. Like there's a DSDR. I know it's basically demographic data for social research, but I'm not sure why it's called DSDR. I'll get back to you on that. But have been doing 20 years of sharing data that are extremely relevant for demographers, social demographers, and their friends who study health and health inequalities. The Research Center for Minority Data, Resource Center for Minority Data is another one that ICPSR puts out there for the rest of the world in order to improve everyone's social science. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to my incredible colleague from PSC. But I just really want to encourage you to look through some of the remarkable things that are happening in this building just down the hall. There's so much excellence, it's really hard to fit it in a 20-minute talk. But I'm incredibly excited about the next generation of work that's being done to study health inequities and ideally to help ameliorate them. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Sarah. Our next speaker is Dr. Arline Geronimus, who is a professor of health behavior and health equity at the School of Public Health, as well as a research professor here at Pop Studies. Dr. Geronimus originated the popular biopsychosocial analytic framework weathering, and much of her research has focused on developing and testing this structurally rooted theory, including thinking about biological mediators of the weathering process, as well as these structured social dynamics that activate stress responses. So today she'll speak on her work, as well as, I believe, discuss some of the training programs or where trainees have gone out of ISR. So please welcome Dr. Geronimus.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So Sarah did this great job of the breadth of what we have to offer at ISR, and I can't go that, I would say I'm going to do the depth, but the reality is in 20 minutes you can only go so deep. But I'm going to talk about my experience here and what I think is very exciting about ISR for health equity research. So I've been a University of Michigan faculty member for 37 years, and my primary appointment is at the School of Public Health. But I've also been a faculty member at the Population Study Center through most of the time I've been here. And when I first accepted the PSC appointment in about 1990, I was somewhat unusual in having research interests in U.S. population health inequities at all. It just wasn't a real area at that time. So much has changed. And I was alone in not being a card-carrying sociologist or economist. Hard as it is to believe now, when we have a wealth of faculty throughout ISR with related interests, my deep interest in structural and biological mechanisms that translate social into health inequities was literally unique at that time. Moreover, my developing research program focused on U.S. Black-white inequities in maternal and child health at first, and served to complicate, if not fully contest, a reigning shibboleth in population studies, as the esteemed Dorothy Nortman, oh, this is not my first slide. As the esteemed Dorothy Nortman from the Population Council had put it in a report in 1974, indeed, it is common knowledge there exists an optimal maternal age for reproductive outcomes. Departing from this optimal age, whether younger or older, increases the risk of adverse birth outcomes. What was known as the true age effects paradigm declared that reproductive, developmental, biological processes were universal and determined maternal age patterns of risk. Socioeconomic differences might influence the level of risk at a given maternal age across populations, but the maternal age pattern of risk was fundamental, set in stone, pertained worldwide. Based on this assessment, policy to reduce or eliminate maternal and child health inequities in the U.S. was focused on increasing access to prenatal care, changing individual unhealthy behavior during pregnancy, but a national campaign was mounted to prevent teen births. And you can see the logic. At that time, almost half of U.S. Black first-time mothers were teens, compared to about 15% of white mothers. And applying the true age effects reasoning implied that major reductions in inequities and adverse pregnancy outcomes could be realized simply by shifting the maternal age distribution to beyond the teen ages, especially among Black or working class mothers. I, being oppositional, questioned the true age effects paradigm at all. I felt its evidentiary base was more common sense than rigorously empirical, and I doubted that adverse pregnancy outcomes would be importantly reduced by preventing teen births alone, especially given what a vague and imprecise category teen births is, which frankly no psychometrician would consider a valid construct. Instead, I posited that differences in structured opportunities, constraints, and their translation into very different lived experiences for US Black compared to white women were not only the major drivers of entrenched health inequities, but they also coalesced into dynamic and dramatic variation in the maternal age trajectories of risk themselves, owing to the impacts of either structured privilege or structured oppression on the body. And I further posited that populations understood the levels and relative risks associated with different maternal ages in their own context, as well as the stakes and trade-offs they faced, given the different facts and values of their lives. So in early descriptive research, I found that maternal age trajectories of risk for poor birth outcomes do diverge importantly between Black and white birthing people, as according to the true age effects paradigm, they should not. And they diverge not only in terms of level, but in terms of which ages constitute the lowest or highest risk maternal ages. And I began documenting this fact using data from the late 1970s, but it pertains today, and I brought a couple examples in the US. So this is maternal age specific rates of very low birth weight for Black women, the orange curves, compared to white women on average in the United States. And this is pre-COVID. COVID has wreaked havoc with maternal and child health as it has with so much else. So I'm concerned with these factors that were occurring for 30 years, 50 years, 100 years before then. And so I wanted to not contaminate it with COVID sequelae. In any case, if you look at this, you'll see this very simple graph, descriptive graph, is that we don't just see that the Black women have higher rates of very low birth weight at every single age, though they do, but we also see the age trajectory goes from the lowest risk ages being the teen years, and then it increases very steeply and almost linearly after that. Whereas for whites on average, and again, this is on average, if you look at certain segments of the white population, working class, less than high school educated, a variety of groups, rural, isolated rural, you'll see that they have much higher rates of these poor birth outcomes than the white average. But if we just look at averages, and there's also heterogeneity in the Black population to a degree. So if you look at the white national averages, you see that basically almost doesn't matter what age you are. There is a little sense of this, what might be seen, interpreted as a true age effects, and that the teens are a little higher risk, and women in their 30s, especially mid to late 30s, have higher risk, including higher than the teens. But overall, the rates of very low birth weight at any maternal age are substantially lower than for Black women at any age. We found similar things with maternal mortality, which has been in the news quite a bit these last 5 or so years, maybe 10 now. And what we see there is a similar case. In fact, the teens are not high risk at all for anybody. So you can think about this mechanically and understand that preventing teen births would be unlikely to reduce either the absolute rates or the inequities in either of these maternal and infant outcomes. But again, you see that the Black rates are not only higher at every age, but they get higher and higher and higher, and really are basically through the roof by the late 30s and 40s. So I am trying to understand this. I mean, I'm being a little stylized here because I did these curves because I already thought I understood it, but then I saw, geez, maybe I was actually right. So in thinking about what it is, first of all, we now know with hindsight and data there have been spectacular declines in U.S. teen childbearing rates since the early 1990s, but the Black, white, and class inequities in poor birth outcomes remain entrenched, and some rates have actually increased, and some inequities have grown in that time period. And in ongoing simulation work, we are now finding evidence that the increased maternal age distribution of first births since 1990 accounts for the entrenched high level of rates of very low birth weight and maternal mortality among Black birthing people. And it accounts for part of the increase among white working class people. So the impact seems to have been exactly the opposite. I just thought it wouldn't have an impact. But in fact, it really boomeranged if you're concerned with maternal health inequities in maternal and child health. So in the context of working in an interdisciplinary center over the past 3 decades, I originated, developed, and tested what I call the weathering hypothesis, that poor population health in racialized groups, not only in reproductive health, but in almost every dimension of health, represented the erosion or dysregulation of key body systems and accelerated biological aging across cells, tissues, and organs in response to material, environmental, and biopsychosocial stressors, and the high effort coping they entail on the part of oppressed communities. So it's not just the exposures that matter, but it's the attempt to withstand them. And that's exactly why I named it weathering, because I see weathering as having both sides of that. Both you're weathering the storm, but you're also withstanding it. And both of those things have health implications. Withstanding also is shelter in many ways, but it itself is shelter and storm. I had worried early on that those who adopted the true age effects approach were ignoring the possibility that early fertility could be, in part, a response to real life and socially structured predicaments, including the possibility that on average in the US, the health of Black women deteriorates more rapidly than the health of white women, owing to the ways living under intersecting oppressions could transform general and reproductive health with age. And I've been able to produce mixed methods research crossing disciplines to work with social psychologists, anthropologists, molecular biologists, political scientists, community groups, and even sociologists and economists to test working hypotheses that follow from the weathering theory. And the weathering framework is now widely accepted in the field and continues to inform a range of public health and social policies, practices, and interventions at the community, local, state, national, and even global levels. If any of you who might be interested in a deeper dive into weathering, in addition to the scientific papers I've published, a more broadly accessible book, Weathering the Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society. It's won some critical acclaim and awards, including being one of 10 winners globally in the social sciences and humanities as a Falling Walls Science Breakthrough of the Year in 2023. So much of the empirical work I've done testing aspects of weathering was facilitated and enriched by being on this faculty. Some of that was due to infrastructure support, as I prepared and submitted NIH and CDC grants without whose funding I could not have pursued my work to the depth and detail I have. 2 other resources from PSC have been critical. First, it's interdisciplinary faculty, in particular, for me, the chance to work closely with labor economists who are familiar with the implications of unobserved heterogeneity for doing empirical work, and were interested in collaborating with me to test weathering-related ideas at a time when many others were quite skeptical. But most importantly, I want to kind of endorse what Sarah began. The NIH pre- and postdoctoral training grants administered through PSC have been critical, and they're kind of dear to my heart. So 20 years ago, PSC supported my desire to develop a small wing of their NIA and NICHD training programs explicitly for public health doctoral students. This put PSC in a position to recruit, train, and support considerable talent in this area, and it also put the School of Public Health in the position to recruit and fund top students, including many who were first generation and other public health students from diverse or marginalized backgrounds, for whom the objective of promoting health equity is deeply personal, their commitment unswerving, and their local knowledge of the communities and populations suffering the most has both democratized and vastly improved the quality of public population health equity research. I believe recruiting and interacting with trainees has been salutary, not simply for my own research, but even more importantly, for diversifying the population health scientific workforce, contributing to the study of health and equity as an important pillar of population science, and for preparing a new generation of population health equity scholars. Graduates of the public health wing of the training programs have gone on to important careers of their own in population health equity. Some are extending weathering-related research to a range of marginalized US and global populations, including Asian and Latinx Americans and immigrants, and the LGBTQ plus populations. Just to give you a sampling, any of you who know Maggie Hicken, who's a research associate professor here, she's a graduate of this program. But in addition, I just want to point to a few others. Jay Pearson, who's now an associate professor at Duke University, Danya Keene, who's now an associate professor at Yale University, Annie Rowe, who's an associate professor at UC Irvine, Linnea Evans, who's an assistant professor at UMass Amherst, Cindy Cullen, who's a full professor at Ohio State University, Oresha Martinez Cardozo, who's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago, Katrina Walsman, who has an endowed chair in health equity research at the University of Maryland, Javier Rodriguez, who is an associate professor at Claremont Graduate College, and Landon Hughes, whose name was one of the names on the work on the LGBTQ, or the mostly transgender research, who's currently a Yerby postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. So the last thing I will say is that I really vote, PSC is unique in ISR in having these training grants. Obviously, ISR in a multitude of ways does mentoring and involves student research assistants in their programs. So I'm not trying to say we're the only ones who are fighting for the next generation. But I do think these particular training programs, including this intersection with the School of Public Health, as well as with other departments, sociology and economics in particular, is really special. And the fact that training programs receive lower ICD rates than contracts or research investigator-initiated grants has not escaped notice, leading some to consider putting the training program on the chopping block. My experience suggests that would be a huge loss to the field of health equity research. There can be no real equity in any arena where some populations face substantially shorter healthy life expectancies than others, especially when those same populations have the fewest material resources, the least political power, and are often viewed as stereotypes with contempt, fear, or resentment. As the marginalized work to carry on, as weathering suggests, and make positive contributions to their families and society in defiance of obstacles, exploitation, and the indignities they face, their bodies are harmed. So I hope we will continue to understand the value of our trainees to the full ISR mission to rigorously and deeply train future generations of social scientists. Thank you.
All right, we'll invite our two speakers to come on up, and they'll be up front here. We have a microphone, which I'm happy to run around, or people can come up here. So we kind of purposely kept this session tight in terms of presentation so that there's plenty of time for question and answer. And so with that, I'm happy to, sorry, there's like one mic here. Happy to open the floor if anyone is ready to go. Otherwise, I can start us off while you're all thinking and formulating your great questions. So, part of it is, it's not lost on me, especially coming from, the fabulous talk by David Williams, and then both of you highlighting the value of training and mentorship. And so I think, especially as we go forward as an institute, how do you see, so obviously we want to maintain the great training, but what are the ways we could expand to even broaden our reach? Or, what would be the areas that would be important for us to kind of look into further to expand that reach?
I'll start. Yeah, I can think about this a little bit. One of the things to think about is the context of university education and actually of the postdoctoral space is changing. And so in recent years, I think COVID was a particular shock to graduate programs, but even before that, we were seeing universities having sort of smaller graduate student programs in a lot of fields to put the funding for those programs into certain buckets in ways that make it a little bit harder for us to have large cohorts of people who are all studying alongside each other in similar topics. And then just sort of various funding things. So as we continue to try to draw folks from underrepresented spaces, for example, first generation folks, this is a really hard thing to do for a school like Michigan. I mean, we have an outstanding training environment, but it's very expensive to move to Michigan for a few years or 2 years for a postdoc on an NIH postdoctoral salary, which many of you know is incredibly low. And so in terms of bringing folks in who have family obligations, who are financially supporting other people in their networks, who are unable to move to a very white area for a short period of time to be part of a program, we have to think really creatively about non-residential or partial residential options. We have to think about supplementing moving costs and other things that many folks who, when I went to grad school, I didn't have a credit card. My parents couldn't pay for anything. So how do you kind of get around some of those infrastructural limitations, right? As you start to build a program that can serve everyone, and to be respectful and mindful of people with different kinds of hidden abilities, for example. So I think that the landscape and the spaces we need to think about in terms of graduate training and postdoctoral support, so people can do the work they need to do, be part of the academy in ways that work for them. As we face kind of a pushback from universities on faculty power, a transition to more lecturer-based, time-delimited job opportunities, we need to think about what are the careers we're preparing our trainees and our postdocs for, and how can they be important in the science that's being done in a number of different sort of workplace spaces as well. So that's a number of the issues that I think about a lot with writing our training grants and thinking about it. And I think I was grateful to Arline for posing the question of funding. So IDC is this magical acronym that people that run centers think about a lot at ISR. It's the indirect cost recovery we get from a grant. And what that means is when you get a grant from the NIH, the NSF, or even from a foundation, hopefully, you get some money in addition to the money to collect the data or to pay your salary in order that we can pay so the lights are on here in ISR, or that we can pay for the staff that run and administer our programs or help us write our grants. And for NIH and NSF, the kind of full freight IDC is somewhere in the 50%, right? So it's a large fraction, again, of the amount you get for the direct science costs. But for training grants, the IDC is 8%, right? So in order to actually run the program, it costs us a lot more than 8%. So we're losing money on those the minute they come in the door, right? Which is why some of our colleagues who maybe haven't been seduced by the magic of training as much as we have, have been sort of concerned in tough financial times. Like maybe that's the kind of stuff that we need to let go. But I heartily endorse with Arline, just from personal experience and from seeing the incredible science that comes from bringing junior scholars together in a vibrant, multidisciplinary environment. I think it would be a terrible thing to lose. And so at PSC, what we've done is been creative with some amazing donors and used the earnings from some of our endowments to backfill the costs of supporting the training program so that it's not a financial liability for our center. But that requires thoughtful development opportunities with folks who are really interested in investing in the next generation. And I think that the JPR program at ISR that's going on now as well, the junior professional researchers, where we're kind of reaching out to post-mac students and thinking about getting them involved in social science graduate training. Again, like investments are being made. We have to think about sustainable ways to support programs like that in ways that can be financially viable for a place like ISR, but sort of allow that scientific magic to happen. Because I'm with you, Arline. All of my best work has been done in collaboration with my trainees, all of it. It's the kind of work I like to do. It's the interdisciplinary and the collaborative kind of work, and they bring such energy and Python coding that I will never learn to do because I'm an old fart now. But also just new ideas and perspectives to the science that if we lost that, PSC would be a real hollowed out place compared to what it is. I don't know if you want to add.
I completely agree. And I would add to that, that the idea that because the IDCs are only 8% is a reason to think about cutting it, or is really penny wise and pound foolish. As you just listening to Sarah now and knowing from my own experience, many of us faculty are able to do the creative science we do in part because we're working with these trainees, and they're not working as hourly research assistants. And over their programs, they become more colleagues than just students or RAs. And they are, from a different era certainly than me, but also much more diverse in background of all kinds. And part of the moral of the story I was telling about the preventing teen childbearing stuff is that we've just, my generation as a whole has gotten most of this all wrong. And even though it seemed common sense, it seemed to make perfect sense. And you could find associations if you didn't, between, for instance, teen birth and poor outcomes along many dimensions. They just weren't causal as more granular study elaborated over time. But these training grants are what's going to, it improves our research as well, and as it trains the students, maybe not in every case, but on balance, and with some incredibly exciting cases, and to the extent that we also, value having faculty at ISR who have joint appointments in instructional units, certainly at PSC without the training program, I'm not sure how many of us would stay involved. So I think, as I said, I think it contributes to the whole enterprise in many ways, and will have the dividends over the next generations who hopefully will do a better job at promoting health equity and eliminating health inequity than my cohort has done.
And I will say, I think it's the interdisciplinary nature of the program that is what really is the magic sauce. We held a symposium on Friday in these rooms when they were one room with the 4 NIA-funded training programs at Michigan. And so we had biologists, we had sort of health services folks, we had physicians, we had our social science trainees. Shane gave a great talk, but I mean, we had posters around the wall on things like fruit fly isolation and like life course studies of C. elegans, which is a worm. But a lot of the issues that are at play and the hypotheses that are being tested really benefit from fruitful conversation between people with different methods and different sample populations and different theoretical backgrounds, solving some of the same problems around healthy aging and the extension of lifespan, right? So I think that that's another part of the magic, that we have outstanding social and health science programs at Michigan. We're known for it, but ISR is like this special place where you get to go hang out with, folks from HBHE and economists and other folks and fellow travelers. That really is what pushes the science forward, I think, in important ways. Questions?
Come on.
So I'm gonna
to go a little bit of a different question to both of you, because I feel like we have so much research, and I've seen timelines like what we know from research and what's actually applied for our practitioners, how we put that into action to truly make change around improving the health of people. It's like sometimes a 20-year gap, right, between what we know and then what are we using it. And so from your perspective as researchers and being in this field of health equity, where do you see, how can we fill those gaps? How can we shorten the amount of time that it takes, for this research to be meaningfully applied to people's lives?
Yes, I'm going first. I mean, first of all, vote. But besides that, which I think might make a difference to how long or short, or if we even ever apply these things. But one of the things that I think bringing public health students into ISR, and it did, was it brought people who I mentioned, some of them were from communities who suffer these inequities, but all of them are trained in community-based participatory research. That's one of the things that we do over in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Equity. So I do think there's more and more people being trained and I shouldn't say this as ISR. What is this, biting the hand that feeds me? I don't know. But quantitative work, of course, is important. I am not suggesting otherwise at all. But when it comes to health equities, and I would say possibly most anything that relates to oppressions, social identity oppressions, it can too easily be a Rorschach test when you get your associations. I think this is part of what happened in the teen birth situation, from what your lived experience and your, so I don't want my daughter to become a teen mom, but I don't quite understand the different stakes and trade-offs and opportunities she's facing compared to someone else in a different situation. So I think that as we get more community-based work, as we also just bring in community partners in a variety of places, and as we train people from these communities. And I'd like to push back a tiny bit on how hard it is to get people to come here. It certainly is. I'm not suggesting anything Sarah said is not true, but those with enough commitment, those barriers can be overcome. And I just think about what David Williams just said about how he was going to go to Western Michigan, and he was basically told, and for all those kinds of reasons, and he was basically told to come here by having the mentorship of someone who understood the difference. And I've seen, with some of the students I even put up on the board, Professor Pearson at Duke University, he's Native American and African American, and he grew up in a rural poverty where he didn't even have running water, and he was all set to go to North Carolina, State University, and then one of his mentors suggested he apply to some other schools, which he did, including Michigan. And he visited here, and despite all the barriers and all the extended family he needs to help support, he came here, and I think, I'm not saying he had the most wonderful time every minute of the day. I'm not saying we have solved the equity and inclusion part of the DEI equation at the University of Michigan or any predominantly white school. But he understands the value of what happened here for him and what a difference it made. And he's now, precisely because he knows intimately what it's like to be in those rural areas, to be, Native American and Black American in poverty. He's come up with ideas that people are following all around the country that none of us would have come up with. And I think we just have to figure out the ways. Again, I'm not trying to say it's easy or there aren't those barriers, but these are often individuals, well, they're incredibly smart, but they're also people so dedicated and who understand down to their bones what health inequities are. And we need them here. That's as much as anything interdisciplinary or, or transdisciplinary. And I think we'll do better at interpreting quantitative studies too, as we have more voices at the table who have different and real relevant lived experiences.
Thanks, Arline. That's totally spot on. I think in terms of the putting it into action thing, I think I was so grateful to find demography once I got to a PhD program in sociology. I'm a first-gen person. I'd never heard of sociology or demography until I went to graduate school. Still don't quite sure I know what they are, but I am in those fields now. And demography is like the actiony wing of sociology, the dirty applied science, right? That you don't want to admit to loving. I love it. The Population Association of America are my people. We are people interested in solving problems about population change, about the consequences of global migration in the context of climate change and climate disasters, the folks who are facing birth outcomes that are far lower than their peers in their countries. And so one of the things that's nice about being a demographer or a population scientist is that we tend to study problems that are of current interest, that are things that the US government is interested in funding. They're kind of major social problems. And then there are the pathways to advocacy. So I'm lucky enough to be involved in some PAA things where we get to go set up testimony on the Hill and talk to staffers and write issue briefs and make sure the dissemination of our work goes to lawmakers and oftentimes they're young, possibly young staffers who are helping them to understand the trade-offs in funding or stopping some of the harmful programs of the past. So I think that there are ways through our professional associations that even those of us who are really stuck in sort of the academic space can work through with our research. And that's an opportunity later in my career that I've been thrilled about. I think that one of the things I've been trying to do with PSC is to bring in more people from outside of sort of the big three departments. And so we're getting in a lot of folks who are population scientists in the School of Nursing, in OBGYN over in the med school, and in places where a lot of the research is actually intervention focused, right? It's about using the science to develop a program or an intervention to try to change outcomes, right? And I think it's still very sciencey, but it kind of takes us a little bit closer to translating some of the theoretical findings, some of the new measures that we can capture into the space of healthcare provision or social welfare. We've got more folks from social work and from the public policy school. So I think, again, widening the net of the kinds of science we do and the kinds of populations that we find we can integrate into our science is really, really critical. So I think, again, one of the other things that I guess the pleasure of being later in your career is that you get asked to be on all these like committees that do things like decide if you're going to vote for someone's tenure case across disciplines and stuff. And one of the difficulties that we face as a very highly ranked university in the social sciences is that the things you get rewarded for in your career as a tenure track faculty member are not the things that are action oriented, right? They're the things that are associated with getting very prestigious journal articles published and so forth. But as we're able to work to diversify the kinds of folks we hire and train, we also have to diversify the promotion and tenure requirements. And so as we, slip in all these, folks who are coming from a different perspective into that process too, and we start to think about additional ways of evaluating the importance and the kind of public impact of our research, I think. Those are the kinds of structural things that we have to think about as well. But great question. Thank you.
I'll just add one more thing. I wrote the book that I gave the shameless plug to precisely to have something more accessible than just scientific articles. And I've seen how it has served that purpose in a variety of ways now the whole public health state, the state of Indiana, their main thing they're trying to do to eliminate health inequities is to disrupt weathering. They actually call their program, well, I forgot the exact words, but weathering is in it. There's a group in New York City called Vital Brooklyn that is working what they call wellness-based economic development, which is sort of the opposite of something like the MTO program that we heard about, in that instead of fragmenting people out of their own communities to go to better communities, it's instead investing in the people and places right there and developing businesses there too. But it's not primarily about economics, but its goal is shared prosperity and economic development with health always in mind within this very disinvested area of Brooklyn. And they framed a big part of what they mean by health wellness-based development on weathering theory. So I've seen in states or cities or specific communities, people hear about it, and unlike my colleagues here 30 years ago, they're basically saying this is obvious, or kind of they understand this, right? And sometimes I like to think I make a little contribution, because at least sometimes they say they've sort of known it, but they didn't have a name, or they didn't have the data, or so that it validates some of the things that they basically knew in the first place. So I think there's a lot of local and state level places that are now investing in much more quickly translating these findings. I don't know how to feel about the national level. And again, maybe I'll know better in a month, but even then, I think there's just a lot of barriers to implementing what we need to do to promote health equity at a national level.
I'll use my shameless job as a moderator to add, as a junior scholar at a previous institution that I worked at, what was really of my mind is, are we asking the right research questions? Right, getting to both of their points, and that and part of are we asking the right research questions is showing up and being humble with community and partnering with community, and just what I did before was show up and just say, I'm an epidemiologist, I have a set of skills, how can I help, right? And as to Sarah's point, like that might not be rewarded necessarily in the tenure process, but you just have to hope that it all kind of comes out in the wash, and and I have my former PhD student, now postdoc here from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and some of the work we did helped increase funding for lead-based prevention programs in Milwaukee, just by saying that if the children who had lead exposure in Milwaukee were in Madison, that's 10,000 of them, they would be getting services, but because of the burden of the problem in Milwaukee, they're not, right? So, but that just came from a partnership with the health department, and then how can I help, right? We have the skills, how can we show up, how can we help? So I will now return to the neutral moderator, and yes.
Thank you. Given both of your experiences in interdisciplinary research, I'm curious about how you had broken the ice and formed relations with researchers outside your discipline earlier in your careers.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sorry, I spoke really fast. Given both of your experiences in interdisciplinary research, I'm curious about how you had broken the ice and formed relations with researchers outside your discipline earlier in your careers.
I mean, I feel very fortunate because I came to Michigan as a postdoc. And so I was immediately kind of in a place where barriers between disciplines are pretty low. And so it was very easy because we have a lot of what I would call advocates or sponsors on campus here. And so my advisors as a postdoc included Jim House and David Williams, who were like, oh, I know who you should talk to, and would send me across campus to go talk to somebody else in ISR or somebody in School of Public Health.
And I think it does require that kind of advocacy on the part of folks to make those introductions. It also helps to be in the Midwest, where we don't have a lot of highfalutin, doors closed kind of behavior. People are usually generally pretty interested in the science. So I think we're lucky to be in a space where those kinds of connections are pretty easy to make. But I think it takes vision on the part of the junior scholar to think carefully about what kind of science do I want to do? How do I keep one foot in my disciplinary home where I'm going to have to meet these requirements for being, getting a job or whatever? But what are the kinds of connections that I want to make? And I think we do a pretty good job of supporting those here. But I do think it takes, just as Arline was kind of indicating, it takes real effort on the part of somebody who has a burning scientific question that they know is not going to be fully served just by one-dimensional approach from one discipline. And so attending multidisciplinary kind of seminars, being part of professional organizations that have more than one discipline involved, I think those are ways that people can start to make connections. But it does take some bravery.
I don't know if I have much to add, because I didn't have any good mentorship. I should tell you, in 1990, I was called the biggest threat to youth in this country because of my ideas, which I thought was pretty funny, given that, this was during the, after the Reagan Bush era, still during the first Bush era. So it was pretty funny that a first-year assistant or third-year assistant professor could even possibly be thought to be the biggest threat to youth in this country. But I do think the burning research, I just had a mission, and in some ways it might have even been good not, this is probably rationalization, but it might have been good not to have good mentorship, because people would have probably told me to sit down and cross my legs and shut up. So I mean, there were people who did that. Right. But, I keep thinking of when Mitch McConnell said to Elizabeth Warren, nevertheless, she persisted. I think that was, it's my stubbornness, maybe the burning question, the sense of that this really mattered, that people were dying over people doing having the wrong ideas. And so if you have that kind of, I guess people call it in a cliche, like fire in the belly, you'll make it happen. I'm not sure what to tell someone who doesn't, but maybe then you go to a really good mentor who can connect you to people. I don't know.
Any closing thoughts any pearls of wisdom you want to drop on us before we leave back to the ballroom for the reception?
I do have one for people who might not have good mentorship at all, or have mentors who are trying to, suppress them, their ideas. Which is, when I got all caught up in even national and highly publicized debates about my what were called iconoclastic and threatening ideas, I learned to, what people did is they might see that graph like I showed you, from only the one from, say, the 1980s, and then they'd say things like, well, maybe for low birth weight, that's kind of evolutionary, that you could have healthy children when you're a teen. But what about poverty, blah, 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 everything else we think teen childbearing causes. In fact, around that time, there was a cover of Newsweek that said something like every single social problem in the country is caused by teen childbearing. I mean, there was really a moral panic and such a fever at that time. But while I wish I had said, well, wait a minute, whether or not it does these other things, look at this. It matters if a baby's born very low birth weight. It matters if the baby dies. It matters if the baby has developmental disabilities through the rest of their life. It matters if their mother dies, during or shortly after birth. So I didn't have the presence to tell them, to quote Kamala the other day, if I may, sir. But what I did have was, and I think being at places like ISR helped support this, was, well, you know, that's I'm just talking right now about birth weight, but what you're saying about poverty, that's a testable question too. And so in some ways, my own research program developed by testing the criticisms. That it really gave me a much more three-dimensional understanding of what was wrong with this construct, for example, of teen births. It also got me, thinking about not just maternal and child health issues and not just about teens or reproductive age women, but about men and women of all ages. And so by instead trying to pretend to be unflappable and just say to yourself as a mantra, presumably this is a testable question, and then going to test it, I think is another way you can build up the evidence, which sometimes, I'm not trying to say the evidence always supported exactly what I thought. I mean, it was falsifiable, but more often than actually falsifying it, it gave a certain depth and nuance and clarity to sort of what I was kind of thinking. And so it helped me develop the theories better.
Certainly wise words. I guess my last piece of advice or plea, I guess, would be what a lot of people will tell you, which is be willing to show up, be willing to be on that committee to develop a next generation program or a pipeline pathway for scholars who aren't in the discipline. Bring that scholar in from outside the elite universities and really be willing to be humbled by their local knowledge or previous experiences, and to provide them with some of the resources we have here to write the grants and get the money. Mentor early and often. Not always immediate payoffs. There's those just short-term immediate payoffs of being around exciting, lively junior scholars, right, that we all know about, but the long-term payoffs are enormous for us and for the institution. Be willing, as sad as it is, to give up some of your research to take on leadership roles. Like, we got into this job because we all like sitting around writing code and like hiding in our office, right? And the further you go in your career, it's like, nope, you're going to be a manager. You're going to look at budgets. You're going to do all this kind of stuff. And it's you want to run away, but you know what? It's taking those leadership roles that allows you to bring your knowledge and your humility and your burning questions to the front of the research area, right? So take that opportunity if you're lucky enough to be at a place like Michigan. And most importantly, be willing to be stupid and growth oriented. I remember when I was growing up, like, my parents were really not into like encouraging parenting. They were like, Sarah, nobody cares what you think. Just be quiet and stand in the back of the room. And so, what I did was go read a book in the laundry room whenever we were at somebody's social event. But be willing to be stupid and not think that you have all the answers, and be growth oriented, because that's the only way innovative partnerships can happen, is by being willing to not be the smartest person in the room all the time or know what all the vocabulary is. But that's the stuff you're going to remember. That's the projects you're going to talk about later in your life. And I think there's so many incredible people who are willing to do that stuff in a place like this. That's what's made ISR such an incredible influence on the social sciences, because there's so many service-oriented, science-focused, non-obnoxious people all in one building. And I feel really honored to be here. Some obnoxious people is important too, but. Question? Oh, I know who's going to get this question.
I have some historical knowledge of the genesis of Arlene's interdisciplinary research. And what I would say is that, in my understanding, it started at a pop center, not at ISR, but at Harvard. And it had to do with that, I assume, this part. I know the first collaboration she had with an economist was with a man called Sandy Corman, who's now works in New York City, but at the time was a graduate student at Harvard. And my guess is that what happened is he kind of said, I have some tools and kind of ways of investigating some of the things that this person is, Arline, is talking about. So that is actually, I think, a perfect example of the value of having interdisciplinary contacts where people are talking about their research. Because my guess, I don't know this for a fact, even I know Sandy, but I never talk to him about how did you ever get started with Arline? My guess is that he listened and he heard and he said, oh my God, she might just be right. Let's go and I have a tool that I've learned that I can use to, with her, help test this. So, and there will be other contexts in which that's with an economist, but you could also imagine with a biologist or with a variety of other people. So I think it's actually, to the extent that I know anything about the history of how Arline got started in testing her theories, it has something to do with personal experience that she had when she was an undergraduate in low-income communities, and it has something to, but it also has something to do with having been in a postdoctoral position in an interdisciplinary setting.
Any rebuttal or no? Okay, just checking. Just give me the opportunity. All right, well, with that, please thank our wonderful panelists, our wonderful speakers.